The origin of racism. I need to warn you that I'm going to be talking about a very sensitive subject today. You need to know that I'll be discussing some very disgusting ideas, and you may find it disturbing. If you think that's likely, then please don't watch this video. I do this not to offend or to be provocative, but to improve my own understanding of this issue and maybe, hopefully, other people's understanding too. To understand racism, we have to first understand the origin of the concept of race. The Greeks used two words that we might translate as race. One is genos. It's the word we use for genus, as in genus and species. It's used to denote a group sharing a common origin or ancestry. It generally refers to smaller groups such as family, kin, or kind. It can also even mean type or category. It could sometimes be used for larger groups like ethnicities and tribes, but generally it was used for smaller familial or clan-based groups, or even just groups like a genus of warriors or a genus of gods. The other words the Greeks used was ethnos, which would usually refer to the larger ethnic groups. It is, of course, where we get our own word ethnic from. It might refer to the Greeks themselves, for example, as a distinct group with a shared culture, history, and heritage, or similarly, it might refer to the Persians or the Egyptians. These are almost always what we might call nations, or at least some kind of political cultural entity. Latin used the words gens and natio in a similar fashion to genos and ethnos. The English word race may derive from the Italian razza, referring to lineage or family, specifically in the context of breeding animals. It in turn may have come from a Latin root related to generatio or ratio. It's curious that we didn't directly pick up either the Latin or the Greek words. It may have come to English via French, where it also referred to lineage or breed, as in the context of breeding animals. By the 16th century, it had entered English with pretty much this meaning: family lines, types of plants and animals, or any group based on common characteristics or descent. By the 18th and 19th centuries, race began to take on a broader and more rigid meaning, influenced by European colonial expansion and the study of natural history. It became associated with the idea of distinct human groups classified by physical characteristics like skin color, facial features, skull shape and size, and other presumed biological differences. The relationship of the Enlightenment to this is rather complicated. One of the developments of the Enlightenment was in the study and classification of things, as we see, for example, in the system of taxonomy developed by Carl Linnaeus and which we still use today. But scientific theories can be applied in ways that are not necessarily suitable and not necessarily envisaged by those who develop them. We see this happening with the development of social Darwinism at the end of the 19th century, for example. Also in New Age enterprises, such as those of Deepak Chopra, who seeks to use quantum theory to further his own ideas and agenda. Carl Linnaeus himself began to describe human beings as belonging to different varieties based on geography, skin color, other physical traits, and temperaments. These were not at this stage regarded as rigid races, though. Three factors seem to have contributed to the development of the more rigid concept of race. First of all, colonial expansion meant that Europeans were encountering many different groups of people. This led, secondly, to the further systematization of these different peoples. The German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach proposed 5 races based on skull shape and skin color: Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. Thirdly, These ideas developed alongside the increasing slave trade. Society became increasingly economically dependent on this slave trade, and it became convenient to view these differences in race in hierarchical terms. The exploitation of other races in this way was deemed justified because they were lower down the hierarchy. Race, very conveniently, came to be seen as something fixed and hierarchical. During the 19th century, race became entrenched in popular science, in law, and in politics as a naturalized division among humans. Scientific racism became mainstream, and racial categories were presented as innate, unchangeable, thus reinforcing discriminatory policies and social hierarchies. I don't think it can be emphasized enough that this concept of race is an entirely modern concept. There was nothing like it in the ancient Greek or Roman world. It genuinely horrifies and distresses me that this concept first arises out of the ideas of the Enlightenment, driven by this propensity to categorize things. Of course, this in itself doesn't lead to the hierarchical view that later emerged, but it certainly laid the groundwork for that. Then, perceived European superiority, by then understood as Caucasian superiority, asserted itself. This perceived hierarchical scientific racism was then used to justify the slave trade, on which, by then, the economic prosperity of Europe and the New World depended. Of course, this scientific racism didn't die with the end of slavery. Social Darwinism, though not Darwin himself, applied Darwin's ideas to human societies, suggesting that racial differences were the result of evolutionary adaptation and that superior races were more evolved than inferior ones. Social Darwinism became a powerful ideology that justified colonialism and the oppression of non-European peoples as part of a natural struggle for survival. We are evil bastards, are we not? We will use both religion and science to justify our worst behaviour, and sometimes it seems that neither of these has the strength to lift us out of this. Eventually, though, science did start to fight this from within, as did, to be fair, religion. The German-American anthropologist Franz Boas argued that cultural and environmental factors rather than biology shaped human behaviour and differences. He conducted extensive research demonstrating that human behaviour and achievements were the products of culture rather than race, helping to shift the focus of anthropology from racial determinism to cultural diversity. His students, such as Margaret Mead, extended this work. Genetics also played a big part in debunking scientific racism. By the mid-20th century, genetic studies had showed that most genetic variation is found within populations rather than between them. For instance, geneticist Richard Lewontin's work in the 1970s demonstrated that 85% of genetic variation exists within so-called racial groups, and only about 6 to 10% exists between them, further dismantling the biological basis of race as a fixed categorization. I think there are actually two issues here, two ideas at work, particularly with regards to the abolition of slavery. First of all, the abolition of slavery did not of itself necessitate the abandoning of scientific racism and the idea that there's a hierarchy of race. This idea did not die with the end of slavery. It would be perfectly logical to argue that slavery is morally abhorrent while still holding to some form of hierarchical racism. It would be entirely possible to hold these two views simultaneously. The Caucasian race is superior to the African race, and slavery is abhorrent. Note that it's even possible to hold the Enlightenment views concerning individual rights, equality, and universal humanity without actually acknowledging that people of other races are fully human. Religion would be capable of the same trick. all human beings are made in the image of God, African people are not quite fully human. So there's this other step required to end racism, the acknowledgement that all races are, in fact, equally and fully human. Thankfully, science, particularly anthropology and genetics, stepped in at this point. Of course, neither does this put an end to racism. Science has debunked the idea of scientific racism. Okay then, we'll just deny the validity of science.